The Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, all three say that what the Europeans did is illegitimate and illegal because they did not abide by the deal. We no longer live in a world where the economic powers are the United States and other European countries. The UK is far less important than a country like Iran. France is far less important than a country like Iran. Germany is less important than a country like Iran.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on TMJ's Political Current podcast. The UN Security Council has just failed to stop snapback sanctions on Iran, a process that was initiated by the E3, by the UK, France, and Germany, over Western frustrations over Iran's partial cooperation with the IAEA following Israel's illegal attack on Iran this past summer. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, has already mentioned that the US talks are a dead end. But as he always has, he has emphasized that Iran has never and does not ever seek to pursue nuclear weapons. And this is a strategy, a part of what Professor Mohammad Marandi explains as Iran's nuclear posture being one of strategic ambiguity, something that he says is central to Iran's dealings with the international community right now. Now, today I have Professor Mohammad Marandi on. He's going to help me break down what exactly this posture means for Iran, whether it is helping Iran's situation, and what we should expect to see from Iran now that these snapback sanctions are looming. Thank you again, Professor Marandi, for joining us back on TMJ News. And you're coming at a time where we have the most recent update coming out from the UN Security Council, which has failed to pass a resolution to delay the snapback sanctions on Iran. Now, before I get into the details of all of that, I want to ask you to kind of walk us through briefly what this process entailed, why these snapback sanctions are coming, and how come now they have failed to pass a resolution to prevent them from happening.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. When the nuclear deal was signed a decade ago, this mechanism was agreed upon, where any of the countries that are a member of the deal and who abide by their commitments, they can basically pull the plug. I don't think it was something that Iran should have agreed to back then, and it was a very controversial issue. And many people were hoping that this mechanism would not be used, but I always thought that it was inevitable because the West never gives up on any leverage that it has against any country. I often give the example of Nelson Mandela. The United States declared him and the ANC, the African National Congress, a terrorist organization when they were supporting apartheid South Africa. When he was released from prison, he and the party were still considered as terrorists, according to U.S. law. He became president, and he and his party were still considered as terrorists. He resigned. He ended his political career after his term in office, and he continued to remain on the U.S. terrorist list. And so was the case with the ANC. And only years later did they finally remove his name and the ANC from the terrorist list. That's how the United States functions. That's how the West in general functions. They use whatever leverage they have to the maximum. But in any case, the French and the British and the Germans wanted to use this snapback mechanism so that they could revive UN Security Council resolutions that had been passed against Iran years ago, well over a decade ago. Because the agreement and the nuclear deal was that those UN Security Council resolutions would be removed. But if the snapback mechanism was used in accordance with the mechanism that was defined in the deal, then those resolutions would be revived. They would not need another vote in the UN Security Council. It would automatically happen. Now, of course, here I have to point out that the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, all three say that what the Europeans did is illegitimate and illegal because they did not abide by the deal, and also because they did not used a mechanism to implement the trigger the snapback mechanism, to trigger the snapback mechanism. So the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese do not accept the legitimacy of what has been done by the Europeans and, of course, the Americans at the UN Security Council. In other words, the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians do not accept that those Security Council resolutions have been revived. I don't know if I've made myself clear or not.
No, absolutely. And to follow up on this, because I think it helps to clarify, but Iran we know, has been cooperating to some extent now with the IAEA. And one of the kind of criticism that's coming is, the UN and lots of these countries saying we want them to fully resume every aspect of it. And although we know Iran has said, its deal with the IAEA will collapse if the UN snapback sanctions are reimposed. And, what now, given this new update that, the snapback sanctions are coming back, how do you see Iran now responding to that?
Okay, so just first to clarify things a bit further, the Iranians have said, and so have the Russians and the Chinese, that when Trump left the deal, the Europeans discontinued fulfilling their obligations. Even before Trump left, the Americans under Obama and the Europeans never fulfilled their obligations. But after Trump tore up the deal and imposed maximum pressure sanctions again, he revived Obama's maximum pressure sanctions, the Europeans discontinued their implementing their obligations. And so the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese in joint statement and in separate statements, they've said that because the Europeans did not fulfill their obligations, they do not have the right to use the snapback mechanism. And also, they did not use the mechanism defined in the deal to push forward the snapback. So they did not follow the procedure. So because of that, too, the 6 resolutions that were passed years ago against Iran are no longer valid nor legitimate. Now, I just want to add another footnote, and that is that back then, we have to remember, we lived in a very different world. The reason why there were 6 resolutions passed against Iran was because back then the United States was the hyperpower. Russia was not like it was today, like it is today, nor was China, nor were the member states of BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So the United States was able to bully Russia and China. All Russia and China could do was water down the resolutions, but at the end of the day, the United States was able, and along with its European allies, to pass 6 resolutions in Iran, all of them unjust. But after the nuclear deal, those 6 sanctions were erased, were removed. The snapback mechanism that, as I said, it shouldn't have been allowed to be put into the deal. But in any case, the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese say that the Europeans, they do not have the legal or moral legitimacy to use that mechanism. So now that aside, another point is that the Iranians, they have been, as you were alluding to this, I think, point, they have been negotiating with the IAEA, even though the IAEA has been behaving dishonorably. The head of the organization has behaved dishonorably. When the Israeli regime attacked Iran, it refused to condemn the attack. And the head of the organization, before the Israeli regime attack, put out a statement that was dishonest, and it was seen as an attempt to pave the way for an attack. Now, and of course, the IAEA has a history of passing on information from Iran to Western intelligence agencies and, of course, the Israeli regime itself. Nevertheless, Iran did sign a deal with the IAEA. Now, some people would say, have been saying, and I've seen that online and elsewhere, that the Iranians were foolish, they were weak, and they shouldn't have signed a deal with the IAEA. However, I disagree. The Iranians knew that the Europeans were lying. They knew the Europeans were basically saying that if you sign a deal with the IAEA, then we can do something about the snapback mechanism. We'll sort of give concessions, delay it, for example.
Right.
But the Iranians knew that they were lying. So what the Iranians did was they did sign this deal. It wasn't a great deal, but the Iranians knew it wasn't going to be implemented. What the Europeans wanted was for Iran to refuse to sign the deal. And then they could blame Iran, that Iran stonewalled. This is similar, and also the Americans, they wouldn't allow the Iranians knew that the Americans would not allow the Europeans to delay the snapback. So the Iranians thought that the smart thing to do would be to sign a deal, and then when there's a failure, which it was expected, then the West could not blame Iran. And at the UN Security Council, we saw that Western countries really had no argument. And the Russians were very aggressive to the West because it was clear that they were just, and so were the Chinese, they were just behaving irrationally and just showing hostility under Zionist influence. This is similar to what happened, if you recall, with Iran's indirect negotiations with the United States a few months ago, before the Israeli regime attacked Iran. The Iranians initially refused to negotiate with the United States because the United States sent a very insulting letter. Then the leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, said, we're not going to negotiate. After that, the Americans changed their language, and he agreed to indirect negotiations and through Oman. The Americans didn't want that. But after 2 weeks they decided to accept. So Iran was able to carry out negotiations under its terms. Then it was becoming increasingly clear that the Israeli regime with US support was going to attack Iran. I knew about the attack, so it's obvious that the government and the military also knew that the attack was coming. The only miscalculation, which was a major miscalculation, was that they did not expect senior officials to be targeted. They didn't think that the Israeli regime would carry out such an attack on an internationally recognized sovereign state.
Right.
But of course, the Israelis did. So that was even though Iran won the war ultimately, but that was a major failure on day one, an intelligence failure, a failure in their analysis of the situation. But in any case, the Iranians knew that the Israeli regime will attack, but they continued to negotiate. Again, some people thought that Iran was being naive and that the Iranians were being lulled into a false sense of security, but the Iranians knew that the Israeli regime would attack. What Iran wanted to do was to show the international community and ordinary Iranians as well that we did what we could to solve the problem. We were negotiating, but they carried out a blitzkrieg attack. They were deceptive and deceitful, the Americans and the Israeli regime. And this worked to Iran's benefit. Not only did it help consolidate the situation at home, on the home front, but also it created greater sympathy across the international community.
And one other thing that you've, described, and I think it's important in this conversation, you've kind of described Iran's nuclear posture as one of strategic ambiguity. And many, there's obviously lots of viewpoints about, how Iran has approached this situation, but many are saying that it has kind of not been as helpful as it thinks. And that it has actually encouraged this continuation of the, for example, snapback sanctions, which is something that I know people within Iran would definitely be unhappy about because it affects them and affects obviously the nation directly. How do you think that this posture in specific is either working in Iran's favor? I know you've explained how it has many positives, but are there any risks that you think it also carries?
Well, first of all, I should point out that the Russians and the Chinese, first of all, as I said before, they don't recognize the legitimacy of the 6 resolutions being revived. And so, since these are 2 key partners of Iran, that is going to have a major impact on the effectiveness of those resolutions. In addition, we have to point out that the scope of those sanctions are not very great, and they're covered by the US maximum pressure sanctions already, almost completely. And the US maximum pressure sanctions and the European sanctions go far beyond what we have in those 6 UN Security Council resolutions. So the difficulty that it creates is limited for Iran. However, what happens is that Iran's strategic ambiguity is reinforced further. And since there will no longer be any International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors in Iran, and there will be no reports from Iran and no information coming from Iran, that will make it far more difficult for the West to assess what the status of Iran's nuclear program is. And that basically means strategic ambiguity. Now, personally, I don't believe that I have no doubt that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Ayatollah Khamenei has stated that this is an inhumane weapon, and Iran should not produce such a weapon. This is actually similar to the position of Imam Khomeini or Ayatollah Khomeini in the 1980s, when the West was giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use against Iranians. Many Iranian leaders and military officials and politicians were calling on Imam Khomeini, who was the leader at that time, to allow them to produce chemical weapons. And he refused. He said that those weapons are inhumane. So Ayatollah Khamenei is following the same tradition. But Dr. Kamal Kharazi, who used to be the foreign minister and who is an advisor to the leader on foreign affairs, on 2 separate occasions, and your viewers can find this online, basically said that something like, if Iran faces an existential threat, then Iran's nuclear posture will change. And more recently, Dr. Larijani, who is now the head of he is the chair of the Supreme National Security Council, he said, before he was the chair, but still he was another advisor to Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader. He too said that if Iran faces an existential threat, and I'm paraphrasing, that Iran's nuclear posture will change. We know that Iran is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world when it comes to nuclear energy. It has many scientists, Iran has a very large and extensive industrial base, and it has a very advanced nuclear program. And of course, Iran's missile capabilities are second to none in the region, and probably the 3rd or at most 4th best in the world. So if there is a threat, an imminent threat to Iran's, an existential threat to Iran, we all know what a change in Iran's nuclear posture would mean. But at the moment, Iran does not intend at all to produce nuclear weapons. That is not Iran's policy, and I have no doubt that that is a policy that Iran is committed to.
And you're mentioning this. There are, as we both know, some as well in Iran's political class that are arguing that the country should actually leave the NPT or potentially pursue a weapon as a deterrent if the sanctions return. Do you think that could be an option?
Well, as I said, Ayatollah Khamenei has said that it is an immoral weapon, and we don't accept it. And also, Iran has never pursued a nuclear weapon. The Americans have said that after 2003, Iran has not been pursuing a nuclear weapon. And they say that before 2003 it was, but that's just nonsense. Iran at no point was pursuing a nuclear weapon, and there's no evidence for that. But also, there's another reason that makes it something very problematic, and that is that if you have a nuclear weapon, then other countries want it too. Iran has 15 neighbors. It is a very large country. It's not, yeah, it's one of the larger countries in the world. It's 15 neighbors makes it, it has many advantages to have a country by having 15 neighbors. But when you have all these neighbors, it only takes a couple of unstable countries to produce a nuclear weapon, and then you have instability and threat always looming over the heads of people across the region. So that is another reason why Iran does not want the spread of nuclear weapons. And I do agree, according to a poll that I saw a while back, the majority of Iranians actually believe Iran should produce a nuclear weapon. So Ayatollah Khamenei's view is not a majority view at the moment. But his position has not changed. And as I said, unless there is an existential threat to Iran, I do not believe at all that Iran is going to change its nuclear posture. But as I said, Iran's capabilities are such that it would not be difficult for it to produce if it had to. And now that there's no cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, it makes it much more difficult for the West to assess what's going on in Iran. And this is something that they brought upon themselves.
And you were talking about how Ayatollah Khamenei has, mentioned this idea that Iran has never and is never planning on pursuing nuclear weapon. Another, declaration that he's recently made, which has also left many questioning, is that declaring that direct talks with the U.S. are essentially a dead end. They won't lead to anywhere. These are statements that he has also made before, which has led many in Iran to question even America having these direct negotiations, knowing that it will ultimately be to the detriment of Iran. How would you then kind of reconcile these differences? Do you see there being value now for these direct negotiations to continue? And now that these, snapback sanctions are back, how does Iran in this situation benefit at all?
Well, first of all, nuclear ambiguity is, I think, something that is very useful to Iran. And this is the result of the airstrikes and the Europeans and the Americans trying to revive the nuclear related UN Security Council sanctions. So that I think is important. The fact that the Russians and the Chinese have sided with Iran and say that they are not legitimate strengthens Iran's position globally, but also in bilateral relations with them. It blunts this weapon to a degree. The most important thing to keep in mind is that Iran has tried to make sure that the international community is on its side. We see over the last couple of years in particular, global public opinion shifting away from the West. Now we've had the war in Ukraine, we had the trade war, we have internal problems in the United States, but probably the most influential event was the genocide in Gaza, the ongoing Holocaust.
Right.
That has changed the mood globally. And it has made many people across the world rethink their views on Iran completely. And this is something that I see on a daily basis because I'm constantly online or I'm doing interviews or I'm engaging with people. In the past, the West was very effective in demonizing Iran. They had the media, for decades, they demonized Iran, and so did their regional proxies. Arabic oil and gas rich regimes, they funded all sorts of TV channels, websites, and now more recently, they have cyber armies, and Israeli has its own cyber army, and the Americans have a cyber army against Iran in Albania. So in the Persian language, they've been demonizing Iran. In the Arabic language, they've been demonizing Iran. In Turkey, they've been demonizing Iran. In the West, they've been demonizing Iran. And because the Western media had global reach and almost a monopoly until recently, globally, there was a lot of skepticism about Iran. But over the last 2 years, people no longer trust the Western media because the Western media has been supporting the Holocaust. And many people are now rethinking Iran altogether because they're saying to themselves, Iran is the only country that's opposing this genocide. The Iranians are the only country alongside Yemen, countries that are suffering as a result of their support for Gaza, for their support for the people of Palestine. And everyone else is doing business as usual. Erdogan, Sisi, Abdullah in Jordan, Mohammed bin Zayed, all of them, they're still doing business with Israel. They still have political ties, economic ties, selling oil, purchasing gas, and so on and so forth. When these regimes have relations with Israelis, how are you going to convince African countries and Latin American countries and Asian countries to cut off ties? Because they're going to say, well, these neighboring governments, they're not breaking off ties, so why should we? So what they've done is that they've strengthened Netanyahu's hand for the last 2 years. So it's only been Iran and Yemen that have been making sacrifices. And so a lot of people are saying, well, if this is the case, then everything that we believed about Iran is should be questioned.
Right. And you mentioned the public opinion, which is definitely very true. Another aspect that the public has very much recognized, and I think this awareness is growing, is, how the IAEA, even the United Nations as an international body that's supposed to be, neutral and unbiased when holding countries accountable for their wrongdoings, applies a complete double standard by, for example, ignoring Israeli and US attacks on Iran, ignoring the fact that that was also a breach of international law with zero consequences, but on the other hand, allowing for the furthering of these sanctions on Iran, knowing it is, as you're mentioning, is illegal. So, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that despite the fact that people are seeing these very blatant acts of hypocrisy, it won't really stop that from happening? We're having like an institution like the UN, which many are considering like that top international organization that's supposed to be implementing international law and making sure there's no breaches of it, and that's not happening. What are your general thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a fact that the UN is being discredited. It's basically becoming irrelevant. And that's sort of one reason why you have the rise of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other global and regional bodies. Because these Western controlled institutions are not serving the interests of the international community. And the world is no longer like it was 20, 30 years ago, where the West was in charge. Now you see the rise of countries across the global south, Russia, Iran, China, Brazil, India, and so on. And they don't accept the old status quo. And the International Atomic Energy Agency is one such organization. There's the World Bank, the IMF, and others. But the International Atomic Energy Agency, if your viewers go and look at the board of directors, you see that over half of the countries are Western. So they have the majority vote no matter what happens. If you include Korea and Japan, they have, I think, 20 votes, 20 or 19 votes. There's Argentina as well. So they've designed these international institutions after the Second World War in a way so that they will always be in control. And that is something that's no longer acceptable because we no longer live in a world where the economic powers are the United States and its, the G7 countries and other European countries. The UK is far less important than a country like Iran. France is far less important than a country like Iran. Germany is less important than a country like Iran. You have Indonesia with a population that is the equivalent of France, Germany, and Britain plus more. I'm pretty sure. Again, your viewers could check, but I think it's roughly the same or a bit more. So the world does not accept the status quo anymore, and the IAEA is not respected. And even IAEA, in the IAEA, that what the Americans do is they have a majority, and then they start bullying smaller countries and threatening them and saying they'll get punished if they vote for Iran, or at the UN Security Council, the same happens. So they've rigged the system in a way in which they get what they want. But this is not going to work anymore. The world is changing so rapidly, and every time they use the system in this way, whether it's to impose sanctions, whether it's when they use financial institutions as a weapon, or the U.S. dollar as a weapon, or the UN Security Council as a weapon, or the IAEA as a weapon. Whenever they do these, they're just digging their own grave further. They're only quickening their decline, and that's why one good example is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that we saw recently in Tianjin. If you compare what we saw in Tianjin to the previous summit, you'll see that there was a huge change in the direction that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was taking. In the past, it was a security summit, and it was basically a place where leaders got together and spoke to each other on the sidelines. But this time round, we saw that it was moving very much in the direction of of BRICS. In other words, talking about financial institutions and creating bodies that would include all member states. In other words, they are circumventing Western institutions, Western-dominated institutions, because they don't work for them anymore. So the more that the West tries to manipulate the system under these new circumstances in the world that we live in today, the greater the incentive is for non-Western countries to develop mechanisms for trade and business and cooperation that exclude the West.
And kind of to wrap the conversation, is there still any chance? I know based on the latest updates, these snapback sanctions are set to take effect. Is there still a chance that they could be prevented and, they wouldn't be applied? Or is it, a done deal? Is, the resolution, being rejected? Is that something that is conclusive and it's, the sanctions are coming back, or is there still a chance that they can be prevented?
Well, the chair of the Supreme National Security Council, Dr. Larijani, he said a couple of days ago that there's still some proposals being put forward, but it seemed from what he was saying that it was highly unlikely. So I don't rule it out, but I think that it's highly unlikely that there will be a deal at this stage.
And, if this happens and takes effect, which would definitely not be ideal for Iran, what countermeasures, what immediately would you say we should expect to see from Iran once these sanctions are imposed in terms of how it would respond to them?
Well, Iran had a major political success when the Iranian foreign minister, the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers all signed that statement. And the Russians have repeated it just today, the Russian foreign minister, that they do not accept the legitimacy of these sanctions. So that was a major achievement. And Russia and China are two key partners of Iran, especially China today. It's economically speaking, it's the number one country. It's ahead of the United States. Let's be very clear about that. So Iran's, the situation today is not like it was 15, 20 years ago, where Iran was isolated. Now, the United States has antagonized Russia, has antagonized China, it's antagonized India and Brazil. The West is much weaker. There are huge internal problems in the United States, as you know better than I. The divisions in the United States are quite astonishing. Then you have the Charlie Kirk murder and the questions that are being raised even about that, and the economic situation for the United States. You have the crisis in Europe over the Ukraine war. Europe and the United States are not in the commanding position that they were. Once upon a time, Iran was the axis of evil. Now you have all these other countries added to the list. These countries are much, much, much more powerful than they were back then. and the United States and the West are significantly weaker than they were back then. So Iran has many options, it has many allies, but also Iran has this new leverage. And that is at the point that you and I both discussed earlier, and that is ambiguity.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for joining us on TMJ News. Really valuable to have your insight again on this really important topic, and we hope to have you back on again soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was an honor.
If you like what you see here at TMJ News, please like and share, and definitely subscribe to our channel for more weekly interviews. TMJ News is an independent, grassroots media outlet, and you can find ways to support us by reading the caption below. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it.